great honor today of introducing Victor Vies.
Okay. Oh, do I use both, right? Good morning. Can y'all hear me in the back? Okay, so that is working. I have a conundrum here without the PowerPoint because it's a 90-minute presentation. All my notes are up there. So I'm just looking for Alex or someone from Direction if there's a way we can fix this.
We're working on it.
Okay. I know one joke. My daughter Naomi just got married in Michigan a couple weeks ago. Don't worry, I did a thorough background check on her fiance. He thought it was odd when I asked for a sample of his blood, and I said, no, it's just routine what fathers do. But he's a fine young man. They're honeymooning in Ireland as I speak. But I always remember when my daughter was about 6 or 7 years of age, and I was a child abuse prosecutor back then. She learned this new joke at school, and I was in the middle of trial, so I got home late, but she waited up for me. She was so excited to spring this joke on me. So I always remember that moment I walked through the door, and my daughter was still awake, and she said, Dad, what is big and green, and if it fell out of a tree, it would kill you? Do you know? A pool table. Isn't that funny? Go home, you'll think about that tonight, you'll laugh. Go ahead, post on Facebook. I know you want to do that. And while you're there, if you could befriend me on Facebook, because I'm 200 friends behind my wife, and it's starting to hurt my ego. And that's the only joke that I know, so I'm okay. Great. Okay. It is. It's good to be back in Chicago. It's an honor again to be with you at the SNAP conference, and it's good to see so many old friends. The subject at hand this morning is When Faith Hurts. We know an awful lot about the physical and the emotional impact of child maltreatment, but what, if anything, do we know from research about the spiritual impact of trauma? I think for me, I've been in the field for 30 years, but I don't think this issue was really crystallized till about a quarter of a century ago. I, at that time, was working in our nation's capital, directing the National Center for Prosecution of Child Abuse. And I took a phone call one day from a prosecutor in San Diego, and she said, "Today, Victor, in our Children's Advocacy Center, we were interviewing a 7-year-old girl who was sexually abused by her father. And near the end of our investigative interview, we said, hey, we have asked you a lot of questions. Do you have any questions for us?" And the little girl got nervous, and she twirled her hair and looked at her toes and said, "Yeah, I'm just sort of wondering, I'm just kind of wondering, am I still a virgin in God's eyes?" It's a mental health question for sure. It's also a spiritual question. Well, how, if at all, do we address questions such as that from boys and girls and men and women? I was intrigued enough by that. I began to collect similar anecdotes from across the country, and we had a small federal grant, and we convened a working group of pastors, priests, rabbis, imams, frontline child protection professionals, and we said, gosh, when questions like this arise, how do we all as professionals work together to address the spiritual aspect of trauma? And from there, began to write about this issue, began to do some of our own research. Eventually, our healthcare system that I'm currently employed for developed a project called Chaplains for Children to train clergy on these issues and to train medical and mental health professionals as well. So what will we do this morning? We're going to see if we can come up with a working definition of what exactly is spirituality so that we can be on the same page. We'll then look at some of the research about how trauma may impair our sense of spirituality, our faith, our relationship with God or a higher power. I'm going to use some of the anecdotes we've collected from across the country, and we're going to talk about different things that offenders do to incorporate a religious concept into their abuse of a boy or girl, and how that, when it happens, impairs our sense of spirituality. We'll also look at some research that says there's some good news. If a survivor can develop a healthy sense of spirituality, a healthy view of God, it may mitigate ACE characteristics, PTSD, and the like. And then we'll chat practically. How do we go forward? How do we as a society address the spiritual aspect of this? I've got some recommendations for faith leaders on this issue in terms of pastoral care. I'm also going to share with you some recommendations we give to faith leaders when they're working with a sex offender. They often get it wrong, as you know. And then lastly, I want to say something radical, and I think it's okay to say radical things at the SNAP conference. I've long believed, and I've begun to write about it, that the crux of the problem of abuse within the church is we really need theological reform. There's a lot of toxic theology that justifies abuse. And so I'm going to share with you at the end some work I've done on proposals for what a good, a healthy theology would look like. Does that sound like an okay agenda? Sorry. Can you say you to man? Who let the dogs out? Woo, woo, woo. Anything at all to keep us going in Chicago this morning. Just a sense of the demographics of religion in the United States, which will be helpful when we look at some of the studies. According to Gallup, more than 90% of Americans say they have a belief in God or a higher power. 55% say religion is really important to them. It influences their day in, day out decision making. This surprises folks, but there's a study from Rutgers saying that church attendance is actually higher than it was in the colonial era. I suppose in the colonial era with the roads and such, you couldn't get a worship community easily. 40% of Americans attend a religious service every week. 85% attend at least once a year. And some sociologists predict that because our society is aging, and as we get older, we think of mortality and the like, and we tend to be migrating to the south, parts of the country that tend to be more religious, and we've got an increase in minorities, and minorities tend to be more religious than Caucasians. Religious involvement may actually increase in the decades to come. We'll see if that's true or not. In terms of the specific religious demographics in the United States, again, according to Pew, about 54% of Americans identify themselves as Christian, but in a Protestant community. About a quarter identify themselves as Christian, but in a Catholic community. And then you see relatively small percentages of other faith traditions. The bottom line in the United States is about 80% of Americans identify themselves as Christian, either Protestant or Catholic, and 95% of those who associate with a faith tradition are in a Christian community. This is important to know as we go through the research. All the research we're discussing this morning was done in the United States. And so most of the survivors or the perpetrators or others that they're looking at are in a Christian context. So people say to me in my healthcare system, what do I do if I'm working with a Muslim or a Buddhist or somebody outside a Judeo-Christian community? Would the research apply? And my answer is we don't really know because we haven't researched that. Another nuance is many clinicians say there's a difference between someone who's abused in a Catholic community versus a Baptist versus a Lutheran versus a conservative versus a liberal theological construct. But all of that hasn't been reduced to research either. So there's a lot of nuances there that we don't yet fully know. So what exactly is spirituality? Well, essentially the research says it's a very personal concept. So whatever you as a survivor or a member of society, whatever your definition of spirituality is, that is what spirituality means. For some folks, it's as simple as a walk through the park and staring at a redwood tree. This is a definition from the Oxford Dictionary, and they say spirituality relates to religion or religious belief. It's something that affects the human spirit or soul as opposed to material things. Now, if we don't like that definition, we can discard it. We won the Revolutionary War. We don't have to listen to Oxford anymore. But most of the research in the United States says most survivors actually define it along these lines. It has something to do with their religious heritage, something to do with their connection to God. Our healthcare system actually worked with Augsburg College, and we did a study where we talked to 200 survivors of sexual abuse, and we asked them to define what spirituality means. And you see the results. 59% said it has something to do with my connection with God or a higher power, but others had a broader definition. It has something to do with my soul, and one survivor said, I define it as, is my soul healthy? Do you like that? I thought that was a very good answer. Is my soul healthy? One survivor told us in that study. However we define it, there's a very large and growing body of research that says that most survivors, more than half, are impacted not just physically and emotionally, but also spiritually. This is a literature review that was published by the American Psychological Association in 2009, and at that point they were looking at 34 major studies, all done in the United States, on more than 19,000 survivors of maltreatment. And according to that body of literature, more than 50% of the children were articulating clear spiritual damage as a result of the trauma. Well, how does that manifest itself? Well, here's one study that's illustrative. In this study, they intersected with 527 victims of child maltreatment. Some were physically abused, some sexually abused, some emotionally abused, some neglected, some all of the above, which is very consistent with research. There's a body of research called polyvictimization saying when you're abused in one way, you're often abused in multiple ways. 1/3 of children who are abused in one way are abused in at least 2 categories of maltreatment, and about 1/3 of all children are maltreated in 5 or more categories of abuse. So if we really want to address sexual abuse, we also have to care about physical abuse and emotional abuse and neglect because they're so often intersected, we now know from research. But in any event, in this study, they concluded that all 527 survivors in this study were profoundly spiritually impacted as a result of trauma. And it was manifesting itself in feelings of guilt, anger, grief, despair, doubt, afraid of dying, and a belief that God is unfair. What are they talking about? Some years ago, I was hired as part of a team to investigate physical and sexual abuse in a Christian boarding school in Senegal, Africa in the 1980s. And I saw the research come to life before me. I interviewed one man, and he said to me, Victor, I'm just kind of curious, do you think that God understands ACE research? And I said, tell me about that. Always the best question. Tell me about that. What are you asking me when you ask me, does God understand ACE research? And he said, well, I understand it, Victor. I was beaten on this compound. I was raped on this compound. They pulled out my teeth on this compound without a Novocaine. My best friend killed himself on this compound. I get it. I got an ACE score through the stratosphere. And that's probably why, as I grew up, I developed problems with alcohol and drug addictions. That's probably why I can't control my anger. But you know what? I've also done some really horrible things in my life. I've been married 3 times. I've been unfaithful to all of my wives. I get into a lot of fights. I'm just so angry at the world. And the worst thing I ever did, Victor, is I actually killed somebody. One day, I'm driving high on drugs, and I crossed the divider line in the highway, and I accidentally kill a man driving home from work. And I can't undo that damage. I killed somebody. And so they send me to prison for criminal vehicular homicide. I'm now out of prison. I'm trying to clean up my life. But I'm terrified of dying. Because if I die tonight, how does God sort out my life? Do I get a pass because of my horrible childhood, all the trauma that I endured? Or does God hold me responsible for all the bad things I've done in my life? Does God understand ACE research? That's a spiritual injury. Another woman in that case said to me, I'm so angry, I'm so mad at God. And I said, tell me about that. Tell me more about your anger toward God. And she said, well, I was sexually abused by a missionary doctor on the compound, and the doctor said to me, you are so lucky. I could touch sexually any of the adolescent girls here, but I have selected you because of all the adolescent girl patients I have, your breasts are the most developed. You are so special. You are a gift from God. And she said, I developed this tremendous anger toward God because I thought, God is all-knowing, so God must have known this guy would be attracted to me if my breast grew early, and yet I couldn't control how my body was growing. God was in charge of the growth of my body, so I hold God responsible for my sexual abuse. That is a spiritual injury. Interestingly, though, this study and others that we'll talk about say, although you may develop anger toward God, you want nothing to do with organized religion, it doesn't mean that you abandon a sense of spirituality, some connection with a higher power. One man I interviewed in that case said, I'm never going to do it. I'm never going to go back to church. I'm never going to trust anybody a part of organized religion. But you know what? Every morning I get up, and before I go to work, I get up really early, and I read my Bible for an hour or so, and then I go to work. And I said, why do you do that? And he said, I don't know, Victor, you're the expert. I thought you could tell me. I guess I'm searching for something, he told me. That's a spiritual impact. Perhaps the woman I'll remember most in that case said, you know, Victor, for 20 years I wanted nothing to do with God. I held God responsible. I just wanted nothing to do with it. And one day I'm in a grocery store, and she said, I can't really explain what happened, but I really felt the presence of God. And God was saying, I didn't do it. In fact, I was on your side. I was weeping with you. These were evil people who were misusing my name, and you and I should have a conversation. And she said, I just didn't know what to do with that experience. So I went home and I tore from the yellow pages all the addresses of the area churches, and I'd get in my car and I'd drive to a church and I'd track down the pastor and I'd say, you show me your child protection policy. And if they didn't have one, I would swear at them and I'd say, you're no better than the people who molested me. And I would put out a cigarette in their carpet and I'd flip them off and I'd drive to the next church. And then I'd go to the next church, and maybe they'd produce a policy, and I'd read it, and it's like a paragraph long, and I knew it was a crap policy. And I would say to the pastor, well, you didn't put any thought into this, did you? I bet you got it from the insurance company to lower your rates, or maybe some law firm said, oh, it's a good idea for publicity to do it, right? You didn't put any thought into this. None of this in this policy would have protected me as a little girl. You're no better than a child molester yourself. And again, flip them off, put out a cigarette in the carpet. She kept doing that for 15, 20 times till she had to stop at a convenience store to get more cigarettes. And then she said she was about to give up, and finally she tried one more church. And she said the pastor was actually quite kind and said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And, you know, we do have a child protection policy. We work on it every year. I'm sure it's not perfect. If you have suggestions, we love your input. And she read through it, and she said, you know, this isn't half bad. If this were in place at that compound, I might not have been violated as a girl. But then she looked the pastor in the eye, and she said, but I know people like you. When push comes to shove, and it's a powerful person abusing a child, there ain't no way you stand with a boy or girl. You always stand with those in power. And he said, I know what you're talking about. That has been a sad history in the Christian community. But you know what? We actually had the sort of scenario you're talking about a couple years ago. A little girl made an allegation against her father, who was a church elder here, a very powerful member of the congregation. And you can Google it. Most of it's online. And you'll see, I think, that we did the right thing. The father is now in prison, and the girl and her family are still here. And she said, you know what? I am going to Google that. And you better be telling me the truth, Pastor. Otherwise, I'm going to come back and a cigarette's going out your carpet. And she told me That's how she decided which church to go back to, which church was actually witnessing their faith through the protection of children. This is predictable. This is common sense, but it's nice when common sense is supported by research. When the person who abuses the boy or girl is a pastor, a priest, a rabbi, imam, a Sunday school teacher, closely connected to the child's faith tradition, the impact on the child's spirituality is pronounced. In this study, they went into prison and they talked to clergymen, they were all men in the study, who had sexually abused children in their congregation. And the researchers said, "You're a man of God. What on earth was going on in your head when you were touching sexually the children in your care?" And here's some of the answers they got from the priests and pastors. "You know what? God made me this way. God gave me these intense urges to touch children sexually. God gave me this unbridled access to children. So at the end of the day, God wanted me to act out sexually with these children." Or the priest or clergy would say, "You know what? It was good for the child. I was teaching them sex education. They were very poor. They were very troubled. I was helping them out. I did a lot of good. And you know what? Basically, I'm a good person. I'm always giving blood to the Red Cross. I'm always serving soup at the homeless shelter. When there's a natural disaster, I'm among the first on the scene to help those troubled souls. And all the good things I've done in my life overshadow the teeny tiny problem I have that I touch some children sexually." Now, these cognitive distortions were bad enough, but then the researchers said to these priests and other pastors, "Did you communicate these twisted ideas of yours to the children you were violating?" And what do you think the answer was? All the time. So many of you are familiar with Father Murphy, who sexually abused 200 children at a deaf and hard of hearing school in Milwaukee. Among the things he would do is call a child into the confessional and say, "I'm going to teach you sex education today." And then he'd violate a child. And then he'd say to the child, "If you ever talk about it, you will lose the grace of God. Surely you will go to hell." Would that mess you up emotionally? Would that mess you up spiritually? And sure enough, this and other studies found that is exactly what happens. When these children grow up, they want nothing to do with organized religion. Their spirituality, the researchers said, has ceased to grow. It's not, though, just clergy who incorporate a religious theme into the abuse of a child. It's your garden variety sex offenders. So Gene Abel, this is a very old study, like quarter of a century ago, so I just don't have more current data, but a quarter of a century ago, he talked to almost 4,000 convicted child molesters, and you see the numbers on the screen. 93% of the sex offenders describe themselves as religious or very religious. Christianity Today in 2010 surveyed about 3,000 church leaders in our country, and about 20% of the church leaders said they knew at least one convicted sex offender who was active in their congregation. Now that's just convicted sex offenders. Keep in mind, most offenders are never caught. Gene Abel said there's only a 3% chance that a sex offender ever gets caught. So the actual numbers of offenders in congregations is actually higher. The 2006 study on the screen, researchers went into prison. They randomly connected to about 200 sex offenders, and they studied their backgrounds. And what they learned is the sex offenders who were the most religious, who were the most active in their churches, synagogues, or temples, were the most egregious offenders. They had the most victims, the youngest victims, and they were getting away with it for the longest period of time, which led the researchers to say to these sex offenders, why? Why are you so interested in going to church? And here's what the offenders said. "Are you kidding me? That's like the safest place to be if you want to molest children." They don't have very good child protection policies. They got by far the weakest policies of all youth-serving organizations. And even if they have a pretty good policy, they're not going to enforce it. And here's the best thing. Even if they catch you red-handed molesting a child, all you got to do is cry. If you're really good at crying, if you're really good at mouthing the magic words of repentance, they're not going to call the police. They're going to send you back into the flock. This is the safest place for me to be. I'm not saying that. Child molesters are saying the safest place for them is inside a faith institution. Here's an example from the news a few years ago of a pastor in a flock sexually abusing a child, and watch how he uses religion into the abuse of the child, and then look at the impact on the child, see if you can articulate the spiritual injuries that the research is discussing. So Pastor Jack Scapp was a minister of a megachurch in Indiana. All of this is online. These are public documents. But he gets an email that crosses his desk saying that there's this child and she's engaging in some self-destructive behaviors, cutting and the like, and she's very frightened, confused, emotionally distraught. Would this be a ripe target for somebody to violate? This is like a perfect victim for him. And so he says, well, I got this one, I'm going to counsel her. And, oh, by the way, she's also described as having a tender heart, teachable and moldable, so like the perfect victim for him. So he says, I'm going to counsel her, and agrees to do that. And in counseling, she discloses one of the things that's upsetting her is she had a boyfriend, and she thought this boy was the cat's meow and was the perfect friend for her, and they were going to get married someday and have a picket fence and 2.5 kids and a dog named Pancake. I had a dog named Pancake, so I just threw that in. And everything's going to be terrific. You're not actually saying I've got 10 minutes. No, I go to 10:15. Right. Thank you. Okay. All right. So we're good, right? We go to 10:15, right? Okay. Thank you. Okay. Anyway, okay. So she's counseling this. He's counseling this girl, and she says, I broke up with this boy, and I just don't know what to do because I had my whole life planned, and it's very upsetting to me. And he takes advantage of that, and he transitions from being her pastor to her friend to eventually sexually abusing her in 3 different states, which is why it becomes a federal crime, and the FBI gets engaged. When the FBI investigates, they find all sorts of written documentation about the sexual abuse. Here's a letter he wrote to the victim. Look at how he used religion into the abuse. You opened your heart wide to me. You made me more than a pastor. You made me your friend, your confidant, your beloved. In our fantasy talk, you've affectionately spoken of being my wife. That is exactly what Christ desires for us. He wants to marry us and become eternal lovers. I tried to craftily catch your heart. Thank you for the privilege of helping a struggling teenager. You have such a wonderful life ahead of you. I must be careful not to spoil that with my selfish fantasy desires. When we get scared, Jesus sends his Spirit to live within us. I must follow the example of Christ. I have espoused you to him as a chaste virgin. This is a letter the victim wrote to SCAP. See if you can see the spiritual impact. She said, I was in love with you. I wouldn't admit that I was a victim. I felt so guilty, partially responsible. Exactly what the research is articulating. She's internalizing it must be my fault. Then I became really angry toward God. Again, exactly what the research is articulating. For a second, I didn't believe in God. Exactly what the research is articulating. I thought there can't be a God because he wouldn't let it happen. And if there is a God, I hate him because he let this happen, because you, Pastor Scap, told me God was okay with this. This is a letter she wrote to the judge before sentencing. She said, my entire life, the church had been my universe. Growing up, I watched Scap in church. I listened to his sermons 3 times a week. I was raised by my parents and teachers to trust and obey my pastor. He was a celebrity to me, a man of God. I felt most safe when I was in church. I first met Scap when I was in kindergarten, and I still had my baby teeth. So often adult survivors have said to me, one of their struggles is when they do come forward and they do talk to the church says, oh, forgive and forget. This guy who abused you is an old man. He's in a nursing home. And what we need to get the hierarchies of churches and societies to realize is you must see me as that little boy or girl alone in that confessional, and you must see the person who violated me as this big, strong man. You must see it through my eyes. And that's, in essence, what she's articulating to the judge in her letter. As my pastor, she writes to the judge, I sought guidance and counseling when I was in need of help. He told me to confide in him. He told me I was special. Remember a study on the clergy in prison? God gave the child to me. This is what Pastor Scap said to her. He told me that he loved me, that he wanted to marry me. He told me I was his precious gift from God. He made me believe what we were doing was okay and right in the eyes of God. I felt so special when he texted me from the holy altar during his sermons. This is an article I wrote. It's on our website, where I took some of the constructs that clergy and others use in the abuse of a child, and I put them into different categories. The first I'll call perpetrator-induced. The perpetrator manipulates the child's faith to convince the child they're equally sinful, equally to blame. So I've worked with a number of survivors who say they're touched by a man and the little boy has an erection or an orgasm, and the offender says, look at you, you have the same thoughts and desires that I do. You're equally to blame, you're equally sinful. God condemns you as much as God condemns me. Let's pray about it together. We're equally to blame, we're equally sinful. I know a woman who was sexually abused by her father, if I'm remembering the history right. Her mom dies when she's about 5, and then her dad begins to sexually abuse her. She notices, though, a certain pattern. It only happens on Tuesday nights, but it happens at different times. So sometimes Dad would tuck her into bed at, say, 9 o'clock, and then he'd right away violate her. Or sometimes he'd wake her up at midnight or 2 o'clock the next morning and sexually touch her. After enduring abuse this way for 2 years, every Tuesday night, she just couldn't go to sleep on Tuesdays until the abuse was done. So beginning at the age of 7, if her dad didn't come back and violate her on a Tuesday night, she would get out of bed. She would go find her father in the house, and then she would kiss her dad, she would touch him, get him sexually aroused, and then he would violate her. And then he would say, you little whore, could you imagine what the priest at our parish would say if he knew how you've been raping me every Tuesday night? When she's 17, she tries to kill herself. She's in a psychiatric unit, and she says to a psychiatric nurse, I had to kill myself. I've been raping my dad for years. What a horrible person I am. Doesn't make sense, does it? So the nurse says, well, tell me about the first time there was sexual contact with your father. She had forgotten. He was raping her for 2 years until she began to initiate sexual activity, and it wasn't because she enjoyed it. It was simply because she just wanted to go to sleep at night, right? She had adopted his theological construct that she was the guilty party. She was the sexual assaulter. How many of you have seen the 2020 documentary Shattered Faith? Several of you have. It's free, it's online, you can find it on the 2020 website. It's about physical and sexual abuse in independent fundamental Baptist communities. I'm going to play in a minute about a 30-second clip, but I just want to set it up for you. This is a woman who was sexually abused by her father, who was a deacon, an elder, a Sunday school teacher at her church. And listen to her describe how her father abused her and see how her dad used religion in the abuse. And then watch how her church reacted to the violation, and I think you'll see come to life that study where clergy said it's the safest place to be inside a church.
My opinion is that they're above the law. It's like they're their own policemen. You know, they police themselves.
No one knows more about the hidden abuses within an IFB church than Rachel Griffin. Adopted into a wealthy IFB family near Chicago, by age 5 she was regularly abused by her father, who was an IFB church deacon and a Sunday school teacher.
He'd come in when I was sleeping, or he'd come in when I was bathing, you know, and touch.
Would he say anything to you, or
Just
just
shouldn't be doing this, you know, and I'm so sorry. There's times when he'd pray.
he would
He'd
pray?
pray after it, you know, I'm sorry, you know, forgive us for the sin,
Forgive us?
and
When she finally confided in her church youth pastor, Edward Green, he provided little support. Did he tell you that we should go to the police? Instead, Pastor Green also began sexually molesting her. He was 24 years old and married. Rachel was 14. The abuse went on for years.
I have a lot of guilt though, because I feel like it was my fault, because I didn't stop it, because it was just not easier to take.
You were young. You were a girl.
And the IFB view on it was that you were doing adultery, even though you were 14, you know, that I was part of the adultery, that I was sinning just as much as he was.
Rachel carried that guilt to an IFB college where she says she told the school that her father was molesting her. But again, no one called the police. Instead, she says IFB administrators told her to confront her family. In despair, Rachel attempted suicide.
I wanted to die.
In 2004, Rachel took an extraordinary step to break her silence, defy the IFB church, and tell police about her abuse. According to a police report, when detectives interviewed the senior pastor at her church, he He told them that, quote, the church dealt with the issue and Pastor Green repented of sin.
Cover up after cover up after cover up. That's their specialty in the church.
Rachel's father, Frank Steiner, and Pastor Green pleaded guilty to sexual assault and each served time in prison. Today they are both registered sex offenders. But for Rachel, justice will not be served until her IFB church accepts responsibility as well.
You have filed a civil lawsuit against your church and Pastor Green. Why did you decide to do that?
Because the church wasn't held accountable.
Was it held accountable for knowing about it and not doing anything to stop it?
Right. And that's my way of teaching them, because it's a terrible crime.
The church denies any wrongdoing.
And I think it's more prevalent than you think. I'm sure there's many more that are hidden.
So, oops. So you see the research come to life, ACE research, or depression or suicidal ideations and actions. You see spiritual injury research come to life, how our Father incorporated religion. You're equally to blame, you're equally sinful, let's pray about it together. You see the research come to life where so many clergy said to researchers, it's like the safest place to be inside a church. They're not going to call the police if you simply repent, and sure enough, that's what her offender did as well. A second category of incorporating religion in the abuse of a child to keep the child quiet is what I call child-induced. Perpetrator may not manipulate the child's faith, but the child's own analysis of religious doctrine may cause a block. I'll always remember when I was a prosecutor, I was preparing for court a 13-year-old girl who was sexually abused by an elder at a church. And I said, look, I know this defense attorney. I know how he'll cross-examine you. He's going to say, look, the abuse began when you were 5, continued to you were 13, but it's not like you were living with this person at the church, right? You could have turned to your mom and your dad and your grandmas and your grandpas and your older brothers and sisters and your aunts and uncles and your best friends. You could have turned to the pastor, the Sunday school teacher, and others, right? But you never did it. And he'll do that to undermine your credibility. I'm going to object, but if the judge allows him to do it, on redirect, I'm just going to ask you in your own words to help the jury understand why it was so difficult to talk about it. And I'll always remember what she said. She said, Victor, I couldn't talk about it because I'm a Christian. And I said, tell me about that. What are you saying when you say you couldn't talk about it because you're a Christian? She said, look, we're a very religious household. We're going to church 3 times a week, doing devotions a couple times a day. Everything centers around the sacred text. And the only thing I knew about sexual activity is that if it's outside of marriage, it's sinful. And sometimes my body would betray me. Sometimes I had a reaction when he touched me. And he was really good at pointing that out and saying, gosh, you're equally to blame, you're equally sinful. The church will condemn you as much as the church condemns me. And as you saw in the 2020 clip, some churches would, in fact, condemn her. So she said, I had to keep it quiet all these years. And the case we started out with from San Diego, the little girl saying to the detectives, am I still a virgin in God's eyes? Her father had said to her, well, you got to be a virgin to wear white. And she internalized that and said, gosh, my dad's touched me sexually, so now I can't get married, or at least I can't wear a white dress. Doctrinal induced. Even if a child correctly understands a doctrine, they may be tormented by its application. A number of years ago, I was teaching police officers in Wisconsin about interrogation and corroborating evidence, that sort of thing. And there was one officer in the back of the room who kept pacing back and forth and gulping coffee and perspiring. And I sensed that he was being emotionally impacted by the subject matter. But he never approached me with a question. And then at the end of the 8 hours, I'm closing up my laptop, going to go home. And I noticed that he's still there in the back of the room. And he approaches me slowly. And he says, Victor, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? I said, sure. And he said, I noticed today when you told some stories about your children that both of your children have a biblical name. And I'm just curious, is it possible that you're a Christian? And I said, yes. And then he looked at me and said, a real Christian? And I said, tell me about that. What are you asking me? He said, I'm asking you, do you believe any of the stuff? Any of the stuff you read in the Bible, any of the stuff you learned in catechism, any of the stuff you heard from the pulpit? Do you make room for the possibility that any of it is true? And I said, under that broad definition, I'm a real Christian. He said, all right, I'm going to try you on something. I grew up on a farm here in Wisconsin, and my old man used to torture me. When he wanted to punish me, he'd drag me into the barn, he'd strip me naked, he'd tie my hands together. He had a hook protruding from the wall, and he'd throw the other end of this rope over the rafters, and then he'd tie it to that hook. So I'd be dangling naked in the air for a few minutes. And then he had what he called the Bible stick, engraved with all these verses from Proverbs, and he'd pick up that stick and he'd whack me over and over and over again, and he wouldn't stop until the blood ran. Here's my question. Do you remember in the Bible where Peter comes to Jesus and says 7 times, I forgive my brother 7 times, isn't that enough? And Jesus says, no, Peter, 70 times 7, meaning an infinite number of times. And then Jesus says, Peter, if you can't forgive that way, God won't forgive you on Judgment Day. I said, I remember that story. He said, here's my question. Why do I have to go to hell? Because I can't forgive my Father. Wow. That's a pretty deep question, and I'm not a theologian, at least at that time I wasn't a theologian by trade. I am by nature a coward. This is a police officer. He's out of control emotionally. He's poking his finger in my chest. He's got a gun. And so I just said, maybe I could help connect you to a really good theologian, because these are some pretty deep questions you're raising. And it's not what he wanted to hear. He said, I did go to my pastor. And I said, tell me about that. He said, I went to my pastor, and he kept interrupting me. And he said, Steve, let's focus on why after 25 years you can't forgive your father. So I'm just not going to go to a pastor anymore, but you just told me you're a real Christian, so I'm asking you, why do I have to go to hell because I can't forgive my father? I said, look, you're in way too much pain for me to insult you with a platitude or a prayer. But I'm pretty well connected in faith communities, and if you want to exchange emails, we can work through this together, right? And see how far we can go in processing your question. He stared at me for a minute, the longest minute of my life, and he let out this heavy sigh like the whole world was getting better, because that's all he really wanted, was somebody to walk the dark valley with him. And then as he was leaving, I said, oh, by the way, what is your faith tradition? He said, Lutheran. I happen to be Lutheran. Ever read the book, God Winks at You? Sometimes God is just saying, this is what you're supposed to do. So I thought this would be easy, because I married deep into the Lutheran community. And so I just sent out a blanket email and said, hypothetically, I've got this question here, and I'm wondering what you Lutheran theologians have to say. And somebody emailed me back and said, well, he's taking Peter too literally, or really Jesus was just scolding Peter. You want to get into heaven for your perfection and try to forgive like God. He was just kind of humbling Peter. It has nothing to do with you're going to go to hell if you can't forgive. And I thought, well, that's not how I read it, but you're the pastor. So I said, I don't know if this is the answer, but here's a preliminary thought. I said, what do you think about that? And the guy emails me back and says, I'm not trying to forgive my father. I have no intention of forgiving him. So why do I have to go to hell? And I said, I'll get back to you. So I emailed the pastor and I said, what sort of crap advice did you give here? Where'd you get your divinity degree, out of a Cracker Jack box? That's a horrible answer there. And so another theologian chimed in and said, well, maybe recommend to him Corrie ten Boom's writings. She was a survivor of the Holocaust, and one of her books she talks about, she was giving a lecture on forgiveness, and this man came up to her and said, that's just a bunch of BS. You couldn't truly forgive anybody. And she says, not by myself I couldn't, but with the help of God all things are possible. And this man removed his hat, and she realized, this was the Nazi guard who murdered my sister. And she says to him, you're right, I don't know that I can forgive you. Leave me alone for a few months and let me process this. And she goes on to write, she begins to process what is forgiveness. It's not the toleration of evil. This guy's a murderer. We can turn him over to the authorities. They want to execute him. So be it. There are earthly consequences to our conduct. So it's certainly not the toleration of his evil. So what is forgiveness? Maybe it's God's gift to me to let go of my anger. Maybe it's my witness to the world. Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi advanced those sort of theological constructs. So I shared those thoughts with this man. He read it, and a few weeks later he emailed me and said, I love Miss ten Boom. But you know what? If I were alone with my dad and I knew I'd get away with it, a bullet would go through his brain. So I'm just wondering, what else you got for me? I said, I'm not talking to any more pastors. I'm just going to figure it out on my own. This guy's a Lutheran, and Luther has 60,000 pages of writings in English. And so I buy this CD-ROM, and I just start to Google it. And it turns out Martin Luther was a victim of child abuse. His father beat him till the blood ran. His mother beat him till he ran away from home. He was beaten in schools, and he talked about it boldly in some of his writings. And in one of the Table Talk entries, somebody said, what if somebody hurt you so bad you can't forgive? Do you lose the grace of God? And Martin Luther said, no, absolutely not. That would cheapen the grace of God. God forgives even our inability to forgive. So sometimes you're just hurt so bad you can't do it, and so just move on. And I thought, well, that was a pretty good answer. And so I send that to him, and because I'm quoting his guy, he really liked it. And suddenly this great weight of the world goes away. He doesn't think he's going to go to hell anymore. That's what good pastoral care is all about. How do we figure out a construct that is in this person's culture or tradition that can help with the theological question? Institution-induced, many institutions are more interested in addressing the spiritual needs of offenders than victims. I always will remember as a prosecutor, I was prosecuting this elder at a church who abused his daughter. His daughter was 12 chronologically, but developmentally she was closer to a 4-year-old. And I walked into the courtroom with her, and she saw both of her Mennonite ministers and all of the Mennonite church elders, and she knew they weren't in the courtroom to support her. They were there to support the father who sodomized her. And she tugged on my suit and whispered in my ear, "Does this mean that God is against me too?" You bet, when it was all done, I met with the ministers and I said, did it ever occur to any of the old boys at the church that she was a member of the congregation too? Who was there to support her through this very difficult trial in her life? Who was caring for her? I opened my Sunday paper some years ago, and there was a story of a man, Sunday school teacher, sexually abused a child in the class, and the pastor was quoted as saying, "What a great tragedy. We must work toward reconciliation between these two families." That's the wrong answer. If your little girl has been abused by a Sunday school teacher, what you really need is justice and righteous indignation and comfort for the child. Otherwise, you're just feeding into what the offender does. The offender is always trying to put him or herself on the same plane with the child, and the church, perhaps unwittingly, was feeding into that very dynamic. One more reason we need training inside faith institutions. Religious leader induced, as we talked about, lots of research says that when the person who abuses a child is the clergy person or closely connected to the child's faith tradition, the damage is more pronounced. I always remember talking to a woman who was sexually abused by a priest, and she said, "Victor, as a Lutheran, you may not fully appreciate this, but the Eucharist is everything. And so when the body and blood of Christ is given to me by the man who's also sexually touching me, it's as if Jesus himself was raping me." Well, that's a powerful image, is it not? So how do we, as a society, work to address the spiritual impact of trauma? Well, research says that if a child can begin to cope in a healthy, spiritually good way, it tends to lower ACE and PTSD and other characteristics. It gives them a sense that they're not completely alone, that perhaps God is on their side. And oftentimes it's a story, it's an anecdote from a sacred text that they find comforting. I'm a huge C.S. Lewis fan, so some years ago I read a book called Mere Christians. It's just essays written by ordinary Christians talking about the impact of Lewis's writings on their life. The most poignant essay was written by a survivor of sexual abuse. And he says in his essay, "My dad used to sexually abuse me when I was a little boy. He'd come in every so often and he'd rape me in my bed, and then he'd leave me alone in my tears, my sweat, my blood. And the only reason I didn't kill myself is one day in the church library, I find the Chronicles of Narnia, these children's books written by C.S. Lewis. And in one of the books, The Horse and His Boy, there's a scene where a little orphan boy is alone on the desert by some monuments, and there's wild beasts in the distance, and he's terrified of them. And Aslan, who's the lion in the book, he's really this godlike, Christ-like figure in the book, Aslan comes to the boy, but he knows the boy is terrified, so he can't come as a lion. He comes as a kitten, a god small enough for the boy to hold. And the boy rocks the kitten during the night, unaware that it's really God comforting him through this moment of terror. And the man in his essay says, that image became extraordinarily powerful in my mind. So after my dad would rape me, I would fixate on that image in my mind, and I would pretend that Aslan, this great lion, was pouncing on my bed to comfort me. He'd wrap his paws around me and lick my face. Only he wasn't a kitten anymore. He was the true Aslan, a great roaring lion. I needed a great roaring lion to protect me. And so there's a growing body of research that says if a child can develop a healthy sense of spirituality, it can improve their condition over the long haul. And this was a study in 2006 on 10,000 plus men and women, and they found that those who had a healthy sense of spirituality, healthy sense of coping, who found some anecdotes, some stories, something that would help them cope, it was reducing, it was mitigating the impact of the trauma. The American Psychological Association has recognized the importance of this issue. And so they have published not one but 2 treatises. And they say to psychologists, look, for more than half of the abused kids you're working with, they got big spiritual questions around the trauma that need to be addressed. And so it is appropriate to inquire if they have questions like this in therapy. You can still use cognitive behavioral, other evidence-based approaches, but within that context, explore some of these very difficult questions. Well, how do medical, mental health, and faith leaders collaborate when a child has a spiritual injury? The American Psychological Association says there's multiple options. In some instances, it may be appropriate to have a theologian, a clergy, be an advisor to a psychologist or a psychiatrist or other mental health provider. I consulted on a case where a girl was sexually abused by her dad, and now she was a woman, and she was in therapy, and she was saying to her therapist, I am going to go to hell. I have desecrated the body of Christ. And her therapist was an agnostic, had really no idea what she was talking about, and so the therapist did the right thing and said, tell me about that. Why do you think you desecrated the body of Christ? And she said, when I was a little girl, my dad used to rape me all the time, but he promised me that when I was confirmed in the church, in the Lutheran church, you're confirmed at the age of 13. When I was confirmed at the age of 13, he'd stop. And so I was working toward getting confirmed. I was so excited. I did the examination. I'm going to be confirmed. And then I'm going to take my first communion. In the Lutheran community, first communion is after you're confirmed. So I'm going to take my first communion. And on the Saturday before my first communion, my dad came in and broke his promise, and he raped me again. And so I took communion the next day, but I hated Jesus. And I spit in the cup with the wine, and as I was chewing the bread, I was saying, I'm just destroying you, God. And she said, now I'm this woman, and I know there's this verse where the Apostle Paul says, treat this seriously. I desecrated the body of Christ. Surely there's no hope for me. Therapist had no idea how to respond, but did the right thing, reached out to a Lutheran theologian who could explain to the child, you are not going to hell. You do not have to worry about this at all. From the cross, Jesus forgave those who were hurting his body. God is big enough to understand your pain. God is actually on your side. So that might be one possibility. In some instances, the clergy could be a consultant to a therapist. Sometimes the therapist could be a consultant to a pastor or another faith leader who is not necessarily well-trained on trauma and PTSD and suicidal thoughts. They may need some help, especially if a survivor is not willing to go to a mental health provider. And then both sides should be able to make really good referrals. There could be limited or even full collaboration. I have seen this work in my own family. I am not telling tales out of school. My wife, Lisa, suffers from depression. She always will. But she's very brave about it. She gives lectures in faith communities in Minnesota about what depression is and her coping with mental illness. And one of the things she says when she lectures is, hey, when I finally get a diagnosis, I'm working with my doctor and I'm getting some medications that could help control my mood swings. And then I'm working with a secular psychologist and we're kind of processing what sort of things can add to my sadness and how do I address that when I'm feeling low. But eventually in therapy, all my questions are spiritual. What does God say about depression? In my deepest, darkest days, she would say to her therapist, I'm not sure I was the mother or the wife that God wanted me to be. So what does God say about all of this? And her therapist said, I do not know how to answer these questions. So eventually, she had a spiritual counselor, a secular counselor, and a doctor, and she signed releases, and they were all tag teaming. And she says, without that holistic approach, I wouldn't have been as successful in coping as I am. And the APA says perhaps we need to do more of that. This is a great study from Donald Walker, who's a PhD psychologist. He's done a lot of the research on spiritual trauma. And he says so often children are abused with the sacred texts incorporated. So the priest or pastor or rabbi is incorporating a religious concept in the abuse of a child. And he says sometimes that can be powerfully undone with other sacred texts. So how does that work? I consulted on a case where a Baptist minister was sexually abusing his daughter. And the little girl, 6 or 7, said to her dad, this is sinful, this is wrong, you shouldn't be touching me sexually. And the pastor says, well, there are exceptions in the Bible, honey. And he opens the Bible to the account of Genesis, creation of the world in Genesis. And he says, look, when it was just Adam and Eve, God had to use incest to populate the earth. And after the great flood, when it was just Noah and his family, again, God had to use incest to populate the earth. So there are exceptions. And you know how in the Bible sometimes God comes in a dream? Well, God has come to me in a dream and says our Christian community is under attack. And so we need to begin to populate from within. And so God has asked me to prepare you to be a young mother. That's why I'm touching you sexually. Donald Walker found that sort of toxic theology could be undone with good theology. The best response to toxic theology is good theology. And so among the things that her therapist and theologian were working with her on is actually the devil distorts Scripture all the time. When Jesus was tempted, the devil is citing Scripture, right? And we know unequivocally that Jesus was opposed to the sexual abuse of children, and so God is with you. Philip Monroe's a PhD psychologist, and he wrote an article, The Theology of Trauma, and he says for many survivors, the Psalms are quite comforting because the Psalms are filled with anger and cries for justice and where are you, God, and why have you abandoned me? It can be a way to connect back to your faith community. Diane Langberg's PhD psychologist from Philadelphia who specializes in working with children who have spiritual injuries or adults with spiritual injuries. And she writes in one of her books, one of the vital functions of the church that we've forgotten is the art of lamenting. People who have suffered severe trauma, such as sexual abuse, need to lament. I'll often send them to the Psalms or the prophets. I'll help them find words from Scripture to express their pain, their fear, their doubts, even their anger toward God. We often see in Scripture where the psalmist or the prophets call out to God, where are you? Why don't you hear me? Prophet Jeremiah says to the corrupt church of his day, you people, you go into the synagogue and you cry, temple, temple, we are saved, and there's blood on your hands. God condemns you for the blood on your hands. You can't run to the God's house for safety. Images like that can become powerful. The why question. Parment did a study saying so often survivors have the why question. Why didn't you answer my prayer, God? Why didn't you stop the abuse? In this study, they found the account of Job was comforting to some survivors because Job had all these questions too. And God said, I'm just not going to answer those questions, but I'll talk to you about the how. How do we get through it together? Another comforting aspect of Job, articulated in this study for some survivors, is Job was really ticked off at God. He was, we talk about the patient, he was really angry. This doesn't make sense. This is not just. And you're sending all these people to me that are saying it's my fault that I've done something sinful. And it's not true, God. So what's up with all of that? And at the end of the account, God says to the three people that were scolding Job, get out of here. Leave this person alone. Job is my righteous brother. So apparently God wasn't upset about the anger at all or Job's cry for justice. So maybe it is okay to be angry with God and to cry out for justice. So when I teach faith leaders, here's some of the recommendations I give them. I say you got to stop focusing on the sins of victims. So if they've got alcoholism and drug issues and anger issues and a whole host of other matters that are being unfaithful to their spouses, those are often symptoms of an underlying issue. So don't be focusing on what you call sins. Recognize these as symptoms of an underlying pain. Certainly assist in accessing appropriate medical and mental health care. Don't get outside your lane. You're not a psychologist. You're not a psychiatrist, right? You're not an expert on child abuse. Stay within your lane, focusing on spiritual questions, and then coordinate that work with somebody who is qualified to deal with PTSD and other issues. Do not give survivors platitudes. If the number one thing I've heard from survivors over the past 30 years is, I get a Bible verse and a prayer, and they send me home. Like it's a quick fix. What I really need is somebody to walk the dark valley with me, not to preach to me, but to listen to me and to help me process very difficult questions. Do not require forgiveness. So often clergy right away go toward forgiveness. You must forgive. There's a couple hundred passages in the scriptures about forgiveness. There's about 4,500 passages about justice. So let's talk about justice. Let's talk about mercy for the victim, right? And then if forgiveness comes, it comes as a gift of God on their own, but we should never require it. And then cautiously respond if a survivor says, I want to talk to the person who abused me. Offenders, even if at some level they acknowledge the sexual abuse, they still have cognitive distortions to justify their conduct. And the best way to understand cognitive distortions is to realize we all have cognitive distortions. Who here has ever stolen a pen from a hotel? Yeah, I have. I'm really excited about the Palmer pens here. They're better than the typical Super 8s that I'm really excited about. I'm a chronic pen thief, I admit it. But when I get home tonight, I'm not going to feel guilty. I'm going to lie to myself. I'm not going to say, Victor, you're a pen thief. What am I going to say to myself? Here's the interactive. What do you say to justify? You're not really a pen thief, it's what?
It's free
It's free advertising, right? I get home, maybe somebody from Lewiston says, I want to go to Chicago tomorrow. How about the Palmer Hotel? I got a pin for them. Or I paid for it, right? You pay a whole lot of money for the hotel. I'm entitled to the pin. Everybody does it. Everybody's a pin thief, right? If they didn't want me to steal, they shouldn't have let it out in the open for me, right? We do all those sort of things, right? Sex offenders do the same thing, only their cognitive distortions are much greater things than stealing a pen. And so we need to be aware of that. So an adult survivor says to his or her pastor, I want to talk to my dad. I want to talk to the Sunday school teacher who violated me as a child. It's very important to say to the survivor, well, tell me more about that. What are you hoping for from this meeting? And to prepare them that even if at some level your father says, yeah, I sexually abused you, they're probably going to have cognitive distortions to justify their conduct, and that will be emotionally abusive towards you. For example, Martin Moran was sexually abused at a Catholic church camp by some youth leader. And so years later, he writes in his memoirs, I want to track down this guy. So I tracked down this guy in California in a nursing home, and I'm shocked. He freely admits, yeah, I molested you all those years. But he says to him, Martin, don't you remember what you were like as a little boy? You stuttered, you were awkward, you were shy, everybody was picking on you. I brought you out of your shell, and touching you sexually was how I did that. Do you honestly think you'd be a famous Broadway actor today if I hadn't sexually abused you? And so in his memoirs, the tricky part, he drives away saying, is this right? Is the reason I'm a great actor today is because this guy sexually abused me, right? So we need to be aware of those sort of issues. Now, if the person's an adult, you can't stop them from that meeting, but you can encourage them, if they're going to go forward nonetheless, to have a game plan. Don't do it alone. Who's going to be there as your support network? Others should be deciding when to cut off the meeting if it's harmful to you, and more importantly, have people available to you immediately after the confrontation to work with you. Some of you will remember Kelly Clark, who's no longer with us, but was a great leader in the field, sued the Boy Scouts and others to draw attention to the sexual abuse of children. He wrote a law review article, and this was the advice he gave to faith leaders. He said, most of my clients actually didn't want to sue you. They wanted you to say you were sorry. And they wanted you to say you were sorry with no ands, ifs, or buts about it. No excuses. No, if I'd only known then what we know now. Nothing like that. Just to say, I'm profoundly sorry. But you couldn't utter those words, and so they sued you. Many of them wanted a symbolic gesture. So there was a case where several girls were sexually abused by a Baptist youth leader, and eventually he goes to prison. And when they were young women, they go to the church elders and say, we want a memorial rock garden. It would be comforting to us when we come back to this church. It would be soothing, a sense of healing, a memorial to those of us who were violated. And the elders said no, because then everybody who comes to our church would know we had a child molester in our employment. They didn't get it. So they marched down to Kelly's office and says, maybe $1 million would get the old boy's attention, right? The rock garden would have been so much cheaper to do. Many survivors want changes in policies. They want to be part of that process. Remember the woman I told you about who found a church where there were good policies, and the pastor says, and if there's improvements, let us know. We want to work with you. We want to work together to keep kids safe. They don't want you to rewrite history. They oftentimes want practical things. A few years ago, I got a call from a minister in the South who said, we got this guy who's on work release from prison, and apparently he molested a boy, but it only happened once, just one time, and as soon as it was done, he felt so guilty, he drove to the police station and confessed, and the next day he went to court, and without a lawyer, he pled guilty, and now he's in prison. And so he seems like a good guy, so we probably don't have to have a whole lot of checks around him if he comes to our church when he's released. And I said, Pastor, he's lying to you. And the pastor said, well, that doesn't seem very Christian. You don't even know the guy. How could you say he's lying to you? And I said, because I've been a prosecutor for 30 years. There's no way he just on his own goes in and confesses to the police, and there's no way a judge would allow him to plead guilty without talking to a lawyer. He's lying to you. Why don't you go to the courthouse and actually see what he pled guilty to? I bet you there's a whole lot he's not sharing with you. So about 3 days later, the pastor calls me back and he says, Victor, you are so smart. And I said, could you text my wife at 507-206-109? Because now I was convinced that I'm all that bright. But anyway, I said, so what'd you find when you went to the courthouse? Well, he actually was charged with sexually abusing 10 children. He was actually caught red-handed on one of them. That's the one he pled guilty to. But he actually confessed to the police to sexually abusing all 10. And you're right, he did have a lawyer. And it was part of a plea agreement. He was going to plead guilty to this one child. And then the other 9 boys that he abused, that would go away. He'd have a lower prison sentence. I said, that's really good information to know. So I often share that anecdotes with faith leaders. And as Ronald Reagan says, trust but verify. It's not that I don't trust you, it's just that I don't trust you. And so I need to find out everything I can about your history of sexual abuse. Otherwise, I can't really help you. So oftentimes they want practical things. I actually shared the wrong anecdote, but here's the anecdote I wanted to share. I got a call from a minister who said, hey, we had a youth leader sexually abuse this girl, and now she's a young woman, and she needs some medical care. She can't control her sexual urges, but there's a certain drug that would help her with that, but her insurance won't cover it. We actually could pay for it pretty easily. We got a fund to help people in need, but our lawyers and our insurance company are saying, don't do that, because that would be an admission of guilt, and then she might turn around and sue us. And I said, what's the name of your church again? And he said, First Christian something something. And I said, I guess I just focus on the word Christian. Because you're telling me that your guy abused her. You're telling me she's come to you asking for help. You're telling me you have the financial means to do it. And you know what? I've been working with survivors for 30 years. She's probably not going to sue you if you act like a Christian. It's when you don't act like a Christian that you get sued. Right? So he didn't listen to the lawyers, insurance companies. He listened to me, and they addressed her medical needs, and of course she never sued. I'm familiar with the case I consulted on where this woman was very faithful in her church attendance, and then one day she just stopped coming to church. And so after 3 or 4 weeks, the pastor goes and visits her and says, what's going on? And she says, well, you played a certain hymn. One of the reasons I love this church is in the hymn book, there's not that hymn. And he says, tell me about that. And she says, well, when I was a little girl, my dad used to rape me, but during the sexual assaults, he'd always sing a certain hymn. He'd be humming the hymn. And so it just brings back all sorts of memories. And then out of the blue, you said, hey, we're going to have a special hymn today. And that was the hymn my dad used to sing when he violated me. And so that's why I left church in tears. I can't go back anymore. And he said, you know what, as long as I'm pastor, I promise we'll never play that hymn. And it enabled her to go back to church. I know another survivor who was sexually abused on the altar by her dad. Her dad would go with her on Sunday morning to set up the altar, and then he'd violate her on the altar. And so she said she just couldn't go to church because of altars would bring back painful memories. And finally she talked to a pastor about it, and he said, you know, the early church didn't have altars. We had services in homes. I bet you we could do some house church ministries, and you get a sense of a community, and you wouldn't have an altar. And she told me that was very comforting to her and allowed her to connect at some level to her faith tradition in a healthy way. So I encourage faith leaders to listen to survivors and what does the survivor need and see what you can do to address it. If you don't know already, I'll tell you a seminary story in a minute, but I went to seminary not long ago, and I took a pastoral counseling class, and the professor was Nate Fromback, and he said, look, I've been doing pastoral care for decades now, and so often the trauma is so great, so deep, so many issues, I just don't know what to say and I don't know what to do. And he said, what I have found helpful is to say to the person in front of me, you know, I'm not sure what to say and I'm not sure what to do, but I'm going to stick with you until we figure it out together. And I think that's a very good advice, and I have used it many times when survivors talk to me. I don't know what to say, I don't know what to do, but if you want to exchange emails, we want to keep talking, I'll stick with you till we figure it out together. This is a harder question. When Jerry Sandusky, we were waiting for the verdict, I was watching TV, and somebody said he was with his Methodist minister and he was reading the Bible, engaged in prayer. And that was the first time I had heard that he was religious at all. And then I had a dinner with one of the survivors and the survivor's mother, and he mentioned this to me. And he said, yeah, he was a devout Methodist. He often took victims to a Methodist church on Sunday. And then I actually, just through my travels, ran into a woman who was a member of that church and said it was true. He often took his victims to church. And yet, of course, he maintains his innocence. So I was very intrigued by that, and I thought, gosh, what if I were his Methodist minister? How would I counsel Jerry in prison? And I would start with this proposition. Anna Salter is a friend, a great sex offender treatment provider, and she's worked with people like Sandusky. And she says, look, a lot of offenders are just like this guy. This was a person who sexually abused a lot of people in church, and he said, gosh, church people are easy to fool. They have a trust that comes from being Christians. They tend to be better folks all around. They want to believe in the good that exists in all people. They want to believe in people, and because of that, you can easily convince them with or without convincing words. Every sex offender is manipulative, and they also manipulate the people in their churches or synagogues or temples. So I'd be aware of that working with a guy like Sandusky. I would be cautious to never fall into the trap of many churches where they say, oh, but we know Pastor Smith, he's a great guy, right? Remember that mega minister in Indiana? Many of the church members rally around him and they said, but he was going through a tough time in his personal life. It's not like he's a child molester, right? He's really a decent person. That is not supported by the research. Research says a clergy offender is just like any other child molester, except they're more dangerous. They are more likely to use force. And the reason for that is they feel entitled because God gave this child to me and now the child's not submitting, and so I'm entitled to use force if necessary. So they're just like any other child molester, with the possible exception, according to this study, that they're more dangerous. And they have cognitive distortions. Now, I know the John Jay study is controversial, and I think there's many, many weaknesses with what they did. But one strength of the study is they got a lot of these priests to articulate their cognitive distortions that we talked about before. And so some of the priests were saying, well, you know, the child was equally part of the sexual contact. We were in love. It was a relationship. The child made the first advance. It was good for the child. I was teaching the child sex education, right? All these cognitive distortions. So if you're working with somebody in prison like a Jerry Sandusky, you got to be aware of these cognitive distortions, and you got to knock them down a peg or two. Otherwise, you're not helpful. And that's pretty much what the research says. You have to, if you're providing spiritual care to an offender, coordinate with his or her sex offender treatment provider. You should be as well informed as possible about their conduct so that you can use evidence when they're lying to you, and then confront their cognitive distortions. So if the offender says, well, the child never said no, immediately confront that. She was 6. She was 7, right? A child can't say no alone in the confessional with you, right? And then don't allow the offender to shift blame. Now, you tell me if I was on the right track or wrong track. A few years ago, I get a call from a Lutheran minister. And he says, I'm counseling this other Lutheran minister who's in prison for sexually abusing children in his congregation. And he's got all these cognitive distortions, and I keep trying to knock him down. Like he says, oh, it's my wife's fault because she withheld herself sexually, and that's not what the Apostle Paul says you should do. So naturally, then I had to turn to girls in the congregation. And I'm confronting him, and I'm saying, well, you know, in the Garden of Eden account, the creation of the world, God didn't allow Adam to blame Eve. Eve wasn't allowed to blame the snake. God holds us all responsible, so you can't blame your wife. But this guy is still insisting that other people are to blame for his sexual misconduct. So finally I said to the minister, I don't think you should give him communion anymore. I think you should tell him he's pushed himself outside the grace of God until he can crawl on his hands and knees and really articulate something that sounds like repentance. I think you need to be a little tougher with him. Do you think that was the right advice? He did it. He did it. And after 7 or 8 weeks, the guy was literally begging for communion again. And the guy's sex offender treatment provider said to the minister, what did you do? Because now he's suddenly cooperative in treatment. He's not making excuses anymore. Did we change his heart? Who really knows? But at least we got to the point where he was saying the right things. Tough love, and oftentimes we don't do tough love. We coddle sex offenders when they really need somebody to be tougher with them. Do you agree with me? Yeah. So I started to write theological advice, and I've said to pastors or priests, somebody's confessing sexual abuse to you, you should say, gosh, that has a profound impact on the medical and mental health of the child, and so we're going to have to address that. And, I went to this really great speaker at the SNAP conference. I don't remember his name, but he looked like Doogie Howser. And he was telling me that people like you often use religion in the abuse of a child. So tell me exactly how you did that, because I may need to know that to help undo the toxic theology. Oh, by the way, you've just confessed to me a really serious crime. And there's a little verse in Romans that says we're supposed to abide by the law. So do you want to call the police, or should I call the police? If you want, I can drive you to the police station, but you say you're sorry, so I need some fruit of your repentance now. I need you to confess to the police what you have told me. And of course, you're going to be pleading guilty because you're repentful, right? You're not going to be forcing your child, a victim, to go through a trial. I'll still be with you all the way through prison, right? But let's focus now on some genuine repentance. And I say to pastors, if you do that, they're going to stop crying in your office because they didn't come there to go to prison. They came there for a little bit of cheap grace. But I think this is a better approach. And I gave in the article lots of examples of questions you could ask to see if the guy is really remorseful or not, such as, are you going to turn yourself into the police? Are you going to plead guilty? They're probably not going to answer those questions very well. I was really struck with the documentary Mea Maxima Culpa, where some of the survivors of Father Murphy were writing letters to the church hierarchy saying, why are you giving this guy communion? This is what he would do when he would molest us. He would say he was getting communion, he was forgiven, we didn't have to worry about it anymore. This is his license to sexually abuse more children. You got to be tougher with him. And I think they're exactly right. I love this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was talking about the rise of Nazis and the takeover of the church by the Nazis. And he says, just cheap grace everywhere. Everybody's excusing the murder of Jews and the persecution of others. It's just cheap grace. Everybody can get forgiven. And he says, it's just not right. Cheap grace is sold in the market like Cheap Jack's wares. The sacraments, the forgiveness of sin, the consolations of religion are thrown away at cut-weight prices. He said we need to get rid of that. So lots of advice I give faith leaders on if you have a sex offender who comes to your congregation of how to monitor this person, what sort of policies need to be in play. Again, you need as much information as possible. You need to work with a treatment provider, probation officer, and others to properly regulate this person. Even if you've got a really good plan in place, you need to be aware of the survivors in your congregation who may be impacted, knowing they have an offender in their midst, and have a really good open door policy and figure out how to address their concerns, their worries as well. This is a good resource we just published. I just edited a theological journal exclusively on the issue of child abuse. It's free, it's online, you can find it. Corey Jewel Jensen's a great sex offender treatment provider. She's also the daughter of a pastor, so she understands the religious constructs as well. And she just wrote a really great article for how do you manage a sex offender in your congregation, how do you work with him or her. This was a profound study from 2017 where they looked at thousands of forensic police interviews of child abuse victims and found how often children were articulating spiritual questions to the investigators, but the teams were largely completely ignoring these questions. And they say, gosh, we can't do that anymore. These are big questions children are asking. And so we're going to have to develop effective collaborations between faith and child protection communities. But here's the problem we have in our country. Most psychologists are not trained to address spiritual questions. And most clergy have virtually no training on child abuse. I'll show you some study in a minute that we did to document that. So where are these kids supposed to go, right? If they can't go to a psychologist and they can't go to their pastor, priest, or rabbi, because none of them are trained to address that, where do these kids go? They languish alone in their suffering. So we need to address that, and our center has taken the lead in trying to address it. So one of the things our healthcare system has done is we developed a course, a 3-day course called Chaplains for Children. It's designed for mental health professionals and chaplains or other faith leaders. And we go through this research, we give them exercises, and we talk about what is good pastoral care and how do you coordinate that with good medical and mental health care. Did you notice something in this picture? Almost all the people who attend are women. 13% of the ordained clergy in the United States are women because Catholic Church, many Protestant churches won't ordain a woman. So only 13% of ordained clergy are women, and yet 95% of the people who come to our Chaplains for Children course are ordained clergy women. Now, I don't know why that is. We can talk about it, but it's something I see over and over and over again. Somehow we just can't get the male clergy engaged. Now, there's 3 or 4 men in the audience. But it has taken off in a number of communities. The state CAC chapter in Mississippi is working with us. We do Chaplains for Children several times a year. We've trained several hundred clergy alone through that. We got a partnership with Belhaven University. I think the research is going to show some really good things, that the churches are now developing better policies. They're more aware. They're giving sermons. They're lifting the bar higher. We've done it in Nebraska. This is one of the proudest things I've done. We had an early attendee of our Chaps for Children program. She's an ordained Lutheran minister named Carrie Nettles. She was a pediatric chaplain, so she already was skilled at working with kids who've endured trauma. And she said, I want to work inside a children's advocacy center, and I really want to take a lead in educating local faith leaders and helping children process spiritual questions. And sure enough, she went on and did it. Here's Carrie, obviously the one with the collar. And the other woman is Shauna Galloway Williams, who is the least religious person I know. And but she kept seeing kids in the CAC raising these spiritual questions, and she was aware of the research and said, I'm just not going to ignore it anymore, because my hostility toward spirituality is not as important as the needs of these children. And she ends up hiring Carrie Nettles. And what sort of things does Carrie do? Well, when a child has a spiritual question, she figures out who's the right person to work with this child and make sure he or she is properly trained and make sure it's appropriately assessed. And sometimes she's the person who does it. She tells me the story of a boy who was sexually abused by his dad, and of course dad goes to prison, and the boy is taken away from dad and mom because mom was supportive of dad. And so the boy's in foster care and is saying to Carrie in this CAC, you know, what I really want to do is take communion. And she says, tell me about that. Why can't you take communion? And she said, because I'm gay. And the church knows about that. It kind of came out when I was talking about the sexual abuse. That's how Dad kept me quiet. He'd rat me out and tell everybody I was gay, and the church would condemn me. And they did. And one day I tried to take communion, and they actually physically removed me from the altar and threw me outside. And she said, if that's really what you want, I can find a church that will support you and allow you to have communion. And he says that was the best day of my life when I could take communion again. So it's just listening to the survivor and what can I do to find you a healthy place, right? So anyway, I love Carrie. She's an amazing person. Gia's here from the Jewish community, and some years ago, Shira Berkovitz is a PhD psychologist and a lawyer who interned for our center, and she was developing policy guides for synagogues. And she developed this group called Sacred Spaces. I'm on their board of directors, and they're doing amazing things in the Jewish community around the world. And so check out their website sometime, Jewish Sacred Spaces, it's called. In the Christian community, Basile Chavidjian, Billy Graham's grandson, I know he taught at SNAP some years ago. He's doing good things in the evangelical world. They've got something now called a church certification program where you could certify a church for meeting certain standards. I think we should encourage that. I love this program that began in South Carolina called Halos, where a doctor said, I'm so sick and tired of the church not getting on board and helping these children. And so she got 50 churches and synagogues who wanted to engage in child abuse prevention initiatives. And they implemented a program called Adopt a Social Worker. And they said, we love you, social workers, and anything you need, let us know. And if you have a child who has a need that the government can't address, you let us know, and we'll do what we can. So there was a child who was tortured, was chained in a cellar for years, eventually was rescued and integrated back into school. And now she's about 17, and the boy asks her out to prom. She doesn't have money for a prom dress. She doesn't know what to do. She explains the problem to her foster parents, who explain the situation to her social worker. Her social worker explains the situation to Halos. They just send out a blanket email to their Halos partners, and immediately somebody says, I got that covered. I actually have a dress shop. She can come down anytime, and the best prom dress is what she's going to have, whatever she wants. And somebody says, oh, you know, I can do you one better. I'm a manager at the best restaurant here in Charleston, and her and her date, very best dinner on the house. They can come by another time, anytime they want. Another guy says, well, I actually run a limousine company, and I'll donate a limo and a driver all night for her and her boyfriend. So, well, all she wanted was a prom dress, and properly touching the hearts. There were a lot of lay Christians who said, I can help, I can go a little bit further. And the Office of Victims of Crime has recognized this as a promising program, and they actually have toolkits to help implement it. We have a Care in Action, we call it Care in Action in Minnesota in my community. The Centers for Disease Control says these are minimal standards every youth organization should have. But our center says, actually, these standards are pretty low because they're focusing only on sexual abuse. That's what lawyers and insurance companies say, right? Insurance companies say to a church, let's develop policies to protect kids from being sexually abused in the church because those are the kids that sue us. What our center says, You should actually care about all abused kids, not just the ones that are going to sue you. So let's also be concerned about physical abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. Let's be concerned about the sexual abuse in the home. And oh, by the way, if you care about kids being sexually abused by a leader in your church, oftentimes they're really good at picking out the child who's got a hole in their heart. So you still need to care about these other things, even if protecting kids from abuse in the church is all you're worried about. So I'm excited about this. Boz and Shira, who I told you about, collaborated and developed this really great treatise that goes well beyond the CDC standards. It's part of the Grace Certification Program, and a Jewish version will come out later this year. We need to teach kids personal safety. We need to educate all the adults in congregations as well. This is an article we published a week or so ago, my friend Allison Fay. And I love the analogy she says to faith leaders. She says, for those of you who are in a Christian community, did you ever notice that the entire church was founded in the midst of child protection? Jesus was about to be killed, right? And God says, you people down there should do something about it. And Joseph and Mary and the wise men said, we're not going to let him be killed. We're going to bend over backwards. We're going to lie. We're going to move out of the country. We're going to do what we can to keep this child safe. And she says, just be like Mary and Joseph and the wise men and keep your kids safe, because that's how the church was founded. And we've forgotten it. And there's so much. The keynoter last night spoke about toxic theology. There's so many passages of Scripture that are used to hurt children. A passage in Matthew 18 is used to discourage people from making a mandated report. There's a verse in Romans that is used to discourage survivors from seeking appropriate counseling. There are a handful of verses used by 20 Christian sects to say even life-saving medical care should be withheld from children. So in Idaho, for example, lots of children die from treatable conditions like diabetes, all ironically in the name of Jesus. And then there's 6 verses in Proverbs that people use to justify beating. More than half of substantiated physical abuse cases start out as what people call euphemistically spanking, and they end up in bruises, broken bones, or death. And some theological constructs say we should begin corporal punishment in infancy. And so CNN did a series of articles about that. But here's the biggest theological problem that I see, at least in the Christian community, is people just don't take Jesus seriously. And we rewrite what he said about children. So in seminary, I did a thesis just on that. That'll be published as a book. So I really delved into the Greek, everything Jesus was saying about children. And we kind of forget this verse in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus puts a kid in the crowd and says, this is it. This is the fault line. Whoever receives one of these children in my name welcomes me, and they're not just welcoming me, they're welcoming God. So let's tear that apart. What was Jesus saying to his followers? He was referencing ancient Jewish customs, and those customs said how you treat the messenger says everything about what you think of the person who sent the message. So what he's saying is children are messengers from God, and how you treat this child really tells me what you think about God. That's pretty strong words, right? And so most scholars say you really define a follower of Christ depending on how you treat children. And yet we've whitewashed it. We've rewritten it. So if you pull off of your shelf tonight the Catholic Study Bible on that passage, it's nothing about children are the center of God's creation. It's instead, well, Jesus was trying to humble the disciples a little bit. It was really a lesson for the disciples. And kind of in the background is the whole issue of children. That's not at all what Jesus was saying. People say, well, did Jesus ever say anything specifically about child sexual abuse? Actually, he did. This passage from the Gospel of Mark, better a millstone around your neck drowned in the sea than to hurt a child, many of the foremost scholars in the world say that was a very explicit reference to the child sexual abuse prevalent in his day. So let's tear it apart. The little ones is a Greek adjective for children, so he's clearly talking about children. And he says anything you do to damage a child's faith, this is going to be pretty significant. And a millstone, of course, is what the donkey is doing here. So it's a pretty harsh punishment for not caring for children, is what he's saying. Well, how does it relate to sexual abuse? William Loader is the world's foremost expert on sexuality at the time of Jesus. And so he's written several accomplished treatises. And he says, well, this better millstone reference is going back to the passage of children are God's messengers, and how you treat them says what you really think about God. And so Jesus is very sternly saying, don't you dare hurt a child because this could damage their faith, and I'm going to be pretty serious about it. And then Loder says, and he's probably specifically talking about sexual abuse, because the following verses say, you sin with your eyes, you're better to gouge out your eyes than sin with your eyes, so on and so forth. And he says all of these are sexual euphemisms from the Hebrew text. And so probably what Jesus is saying when he's talking about children in the Better Millstone passage is, don't even think about it. Don't you dare go out and sexually abuse a child. And if you do, you better have some earthly consequences, because that would be better for you than what I'm going to do with you on Judgment Day. How oftentimes have you heard that from the pulpit? But that's actually what he was saying. And it's not just Loder. Here's another quote from Loder making that point very clear. And he's saying pederasty was a big deal, and the Jews were very worried about the Roman Greco practice of sexually abusing boys. And Jesus was saying to the fledgling Christian church, don't let it into my church. Don't let what the Romans and Greeks are doing into my church. Don't go out and sexually abuse these children. And other scholars agree. Yarbrough Collins is a very famous scholar from Yale Divinity School. She reaches exactly the same conclusion. And she says, Jesus is saying, don't go out and sexually abuse a child. And if you do, you better turn yourself over to the authorities and have earthly consequences here. You better truly repent, because I'm going to be pretty harsh with you if you don't deal with this on earth. And the Oxford Study Bible says exactly the same thing. So the best scholars in the world say Jesus unequivocally was condemning the sexual abuse of children. And even if you had a broader interpretation, we know that abuse impacts a child's faith, and so it is unequivocally condemned. And yet many theologians, like in the Catholic Study Bible, are just rewriting history. So I decided to go to seminary. And I graduated last year from Wartburg Theological Seminary. They allowed me to concentrate just on the ancient text and what is the Bible saying about children. I know my hat is crooked, but that diploma is actually signed. And there's my wife, Lisa, on the day that I got my seminary degree. And so I began to write the theological constructs that nobody else is writing. And so here's an article I wrote on proper ministering to sex offenders. I began to attack those interpretations of Proverbs that justify the beating of children. We just did a massive seminary journal that's free and online, where we had all these great articles, many of which I was citing, that was published a week or so ago. And my thesis for seminary was accepted with highest honors and will be published by Wittgenstock later on this summer. And early research says addressing theological issues, at least with the laypersons, will change practices. So two researchers from Pepperdine took my article on the corporal punishment, and they tested it with some fundamentalist church folks, and they found it was changing their attitude. Yeah, maybe I don't have to hit kids. Maybe that's not what the Bible is saying, and they're going to research whether that change of attitudes results in change of practices. So I know I'm running out of time. I've got 1 minute, but here's an anecdote from my book that shows how theological reform might change all of this. So here's a bunch of church leaders are getting together. Should we spend the money for background checks? And they're saying, gosh, it'd be kind of expensive, and it doesn't really do any good. We're not going to catch many people. We know everybody in the church, so, and it might embarrass people, so we don't really need to do it. I see that happen all over the time. But what if the meeting started out by saying, well, what did Jesus say about this? Jesus says this determines whether or not you're actually my follower. Oh, I guess we should spend the money on background checks, because Jesus says children are our top priority. I think things would change if we addressed it that way. We did a study. Only 3% of seminaries in the United States have any training on child abuse. Only 3%. And that training that's out there isn't very good. So I just want to go 30 seconds over time and leave you this anecdote, because we did start late. Remember, computer problems? So I'm just going to go 30 seconds over time. I've given you so many examples of toxic theology and bad theologians, so I want to cleanse the palate with a good story. This is one of my heroes, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a Lutheran minister executed by the Nazis because of his opposition to the government. For some time, he was housed at Tegel prison in Berlin. Nighttime at the prison was known as the terrible time. It was at nighttime that Allied bombs would land on the city, accidentally strike the prison, injure, sometimes kill the men warehoused there. It was at nighttime that Nazi guards would take men from their cells, beat, torture, even execute them. So every night when the sun set at Tegel, the men in the prison would go to the edges of their cells, they would grasp the bars, and from man to man, cell to cell, they would repeat the refrain, "Till the night be past, pray for me. Till the night be past, pray for me." Tonight here in Chicago and all over the country, all over the world, for many children, nighttime is the terrible time. It's at nighttime that many children are beaten or shaken to death. It's at nighttime that many children are violated sexually. It's at nighttime that many children go to bed hungry. They cry themselves to sleep. They live, they move, but they have no being. These are the shadow children of our country. Boys and girls, young and younger, who from the corners of their room ask us simply, is it safe to come out now? All of you who are part of SNAP have dedicated yourselves, have dedicated your lives to the proposition, we should answer this question, yes. Yes, it is safe to come out now. For who you are, for what you do, I am forever in awe. Thanks for bringing me to your conference.
We're gonna have a short break now, and then at 10:30 we'll have our first breakout. And then after that is lunch. Make sure you're back here by 1:15 for Tom Doyle. And we also have a surprise for the afternoon as well, so look forward to that. Have a nice lunch.